All right. So going to review for, I guess this is the first sprint for you guys, right? Yeah. It's like we still got quite a few people hopping in, so we'll give it just a second more. And so I had requested questions or topics to be posted in the thread, and we have a few of those. How to interpret the model and figure out how it translates. All right, we can do that too, since that all wraps around into one lovely picture. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just get that out of the way. All right, and you can see my Visual Studio Code, everyone. I hope. Somebody give me a thumbs up. I can't see anybody.
Yes,
So,
you're good.
all right, good. So we are going to review some of the concepts, and we're going to look at the ones that were posted. If you have a question, feel free to hop in. We'll do about an hour and 15 minutes, and that way we should be able to cover a fair amount. So let's go ahead and get started. So looking at the thread, we're going to kind of go backwards. In response to Jessica's question about not using writing endpoints, no database helpers, that doesn't really work. Because helpers are not something that were provided for you. I mean, they are at this point. You'll be writing those next week, but those are the tools that talk to the database. And so there's two parts to the equation. There are the endpoints, the routes, and then the models. I don't really like calling them the helpers, because that's not really what they do.
Origin master.
Sorry. Oh, somebody's not muted.
So
You push origin master.
That's what usually, which means push.
I can figure out where the button is now.
To point to GitHub. It's like a URL, right? And that URL is located on GitHub.
I will do that later.
Let's see.
When you do, the way that you deploy is you do git push.
Okay, there we go. And everyone can still hear me, I hope. You've been muted, so we will go yes, but you should be able to unmute yourself. Yes, thanks. All right, so yeah, so database helpers are really models, and anytime you talk to a database, whether it's a SQL, a NoSQL, something like Redis, Firestore, anything like that, you're going to have some kind of model controls that talk to the database. But we will build one from the endpoint from scratch, or we'll build a couple of them. And let's see. For Drew's question, interpreting the model, we'll do that as we go along. And also, I think, where did I see that? I think Haley, I don't know if Haley's in here or not, but when to use or how to use async await versus .then.catch and that process. So what we'll do is we'll actually write a couple of endpoints that use both methods, and you can begin to develop which one you're more comfortable with. So let's go ahead and start. I'm going to move chat over here. If anybody tries to talk to me through chat, I probably won't see it. So just feel free to unmute your mic and let's look at it. So let's start with the model. Let me, can everyone see my screen? Is the font size large enough for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So the model here, so this is, I think, yesterday's assignment, or maybe the one before, I don't know. I just grabbed one and deleted out some information, but so we can build it. But the model, like I said, is the tools, the functions that communicate with the database. And in Lambda, or Bloom, sorry, I go way back. It's been more than 3 years. So in Bloom, we use connects, which you'll learn about next week. But there are several different tools. Sequelize is a really popular one as well. And they're just ways to write SQL in JavaScript. And when you start working with SQL, you'll begin to understand why that's a nice thing, because SQL is kind of ugly. And so here we have our model. This is the user's model, and we have several functions. And a couple of the real important things: get by ID, get user post, insert, remove, update. These are developer defined. Okay, these are not reserved words or anything in particular. Some of them we leave the same, like insert. I don't typically like insert. I like add. That's my choice. So we could change that to add. Now, on line 31 though, when we're talking to the database, this insert is a required word. This is a reserved word. And that's why I don't like to call this one insert, because then it makes it seem as though they're the same thing, but in fact, they're not. Okay. So if we call this add a user, to me, that makes a lot more sense. And then we use the insert method that's inside of SQL in order to add that user. Let's see, what's another one, important one? Remove. So if you go back a ways, you'll actually see this as destroy. I prefer destroy. It solves part of my, my Viking aggressiveness. So I like to call it destroy just for fun. But these are just your decision. Now, depending on where you're at, you'll have user conventions. Typically get, I don't like get, for the same reason that then you're calling a get function from the get method. I don't really like that. And so typically I will say find and find by ID, because that's a little bit more specific to what we're doing, right? Again, though, these are things that are, unless defined by a job or something like that, these are your choices. Okay, so now, of course, I'm going to have to fix all of these. Find, and what else do we got? Insert, add. Okay, so we're back to running. And really, you'll learn all of these next week. But remember, this is JavaScript, and it takes SQL and pretty much translates it into English. In this particular instance, we're going to return the database table users where ID equals ID, and we want the first one, right? So it's pretty much English in that aspect, or fairly close as far as programming goes. Let's see, Drew, did you have another question that you wanted on this? Or
yeah, that's basically what I was wondering. So you import the thing on line 1, so that's where it's all going. And then so DB means it's just going into the database. And does it matter if users, like on line 13, does it matter if that's is users an actual thing inside the database? It's been named users?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of a step that you have to remember. Models talk to the database, and in connects, the database instructions are at this DB config. Again, you can call this whatever you want. It doesn't make any difference. It's typically DB dash config or DB capital C config. And this DB config file are just the instructions that the database needs to be able to find the model, or vice versa. Okay, so whenever you have a model, you will always have to connect it to the database structure. With connects and SQLite, Postgres, that you'll use, this is the method for it. It's a similar method if you say use Mongo Atlas or Redis online or something like that. There's a way you have to connect to the database, and each one's a little bit different. But just always remember that models talk to the database, and so for a model to work, you have to import the database. Now, this DB can be anything, right? It's just by convention, DB is the shorthand for database, but this is just the value that we're assigning it. And users, so if we go to this DB config, if we look at it once more, what it's telling us is that it requires this connects file, which is just auto-generated, but ultimately we're working, this is SQLite 3, and the information that we're working with is located inside of data migrations and data seeds. So these are the paths to the information that we have. And so if we go to migrations, a migration is, and you'll learn this next week, but a migration is how we tell the database what rules to follow. And to answer your question, we have this create tables users. And so this users is this users here that we want to talk to. And we're trying to find information, interact with information about users. And so that is why we have the users, we're using the users table. But we also have this post table, right? So if you did the assignment somewhere, let's see, I guess there's a post model, same thing, right? Now, the path is the same to the database, but the table that we're trying to access, the information that we're trying to access is posts over here. So again, the same process, and I'm not going to tonight, but again, I would change these just because I don't like the conventions that they're using right there. Does that help?
It sure does. Thank you so much.
All right, good. So, and if you're stuck and you're wondering now, right now you have these migrations and these seeds. Seeds are the initial data. They seed the data structure for you. So if we look at seeds for users, we have all of these that are pre-populated for you. And it gives you the structure that's required. So users take a name and some form of string, right? The key value pair, name, and a string. Posts, they take a user ID and text, and you will create these down the road. Next week, you will create these. These are not, some kind of miraculous thing, although it'd be nice. But these are things that you're going to create. And the migrations, like I said, are the rules that we say these are. And so here you can see, again, users takes a name, and that's the only thing that's in this table. If we look at the next table, which is post, this has a text and a user ID. Again, that's the only two things in there. So sometimes if you're not sure what data is needed and it's assignment where we populated it for you, you can go over there and check. Otherwise, down the road, of course, you'll be building those yourself. Okay, so let's do a little bit of cleanup here. I guess we got post. All right, I'm going to make just a couple of modifications because I like code to be a bit cleaner. So you have two ways of creating a router.
So Zach, just 1 second. Some people asked for this to be recorded, so if you can just make sure you're recording this, that
Oh
would
yeah,
be
it's
awesome.
recording. It should be.
Cool.
Did it not pop in?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's recording.
Okay.
All right, cool.
See, I thought
Sorry.
it was. Yeah, so you have two ways when you build a router. You can do the single line, which is how I have it here, and I'll make or you can do the long way, which is like this, how it was before, where you import or require the express, and then you make a router from the express router. But I like this method, so that's what I'm going to stick with. And like I said, I just went in and wiped out all the endpoints on it. I didn't really, since we just need a few to work with. So async await versus .then and .catch. So let's write an endpoint. Let's go ahead and write a get. All right, so this is using the verb get, and we'll just put it at slash. And we will then do our rec and res. And if you see any of the old school videos, sometimes you'll hear those referred to as the homies. I don't know, somebody started that a long time ago, and it's kind of stuck, and it pops into my head every time I see it. So you got the homies, and I think the three amigos, rec, res, and next. And but all they are, of course, is just the request and the response, and if we're going to pass the next. And so we want to get, in this case, we want to get users, right? That's what we're looking to find. And by convention, when you access or you require a model, we use a capital first letter. And remember, a model talks to the database, routes talk to the model. So we have a route and we want to talk to the model. And in this case, we're going to say users. So we'll do it with promises then catch, and then we'll do the exact same one again with async await and show you a little bit of the differences. Okay, so first thing we want to do is reach out to our model, which is here, our users, right? And then what do we want to do? Well, a get is a read function, and we want to read all of the users or get all of the users. And like I said, I modified it to be find, just because I don't like having a get. Starts to get a little bit confusing. So yeah, I will do the find. And then with a then catch, so we'll go ahead and scaffold this out. So this is using a promise. And what happens is when we reach out to the database, this find method, it will create a promise, and it will either resolve that promise or will reject it. And it's exactly as it says. It fulfills the promise, here's the stuff you wanted me to do, or it rejects it because there was a problem. And I like to start at the end. You'll hear me say this a lot. Two really important things I think that you should be comfortable with. One, write the easiest code that you can. And by proxy, that is write the easiest code you can first. And the second part to that is never write code that doesn't work. And you'll see me test constantly to make sure that my code works. I don't like to write more than a line or two without making sure that it works. Okay. And so the catch takes a callback. I think everybody's pretty aware of that. And what we want to do is we just want to return something when there's an error. I'm going to go ahead and do two things. I'm going to say error and return that error in the console log, and then I'll do a res status. And for now, normally we would write an error handler. I think there's probably one in here, but I'm not going to worry about that. Okay. So we handled the error. So if the promise fails or rejects, it's going to give us a console log and a response that provides some form of message letting us know there's a problem. This is pretty much template. This doesn't change very often. You may have a next, if you built an error handler and you want to have a next, but otherwise it's pretty much the same every time. Now, our promise, however, when it resolves, so line 15 is what creates the promise. And when that promise comes back, we want to do something with it. And the promise in this case is all of our users. And you'll see me or you'll hear me a lot of times. This is one of those areas that it's not a specific requirement, but it makes good sense. In here, we're expecting that we get more than one user, right? So we are returning, our promise is returning us users, right? Now, when you do a find by ID, for instance, that returns a single user. The promise is a user one, and so you should have a singular user or post or whatever. And so when this promise resolves, we're going to get back a list of users, right? And we want to do something with that. And for now, we'll just say we're going to return a status of 200, and we're going to go ahead and return the user's promise in a JSON format. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. Make sure that our server is running. We go ahead and open up a new client here. Let's get rid of that. We'll move this over to the side. And we'll do localhost. What are we running? 8,000. And while we're here, I guess we better figure out what our path is. Server, there it is. And API users. Okay. So we will say /API/users, and I'm going to go ahead and send that, and we get back a list of users, right? And that specifically is an array of objects. And if you think back about the seeds that we were looking at, where all of these were already created, these are created for us, and they're in the database and therefore persistent. So let me give us a little extra room. So a promise, if you use a dot then, you need a catch. If you don't have that catch, you will sometimes, depending on, you may get a message in your console log that says something to the effect that you failed to catch. And what it's telling you is you did not have a catch. And the reason this is important is if you do not catch an error and there is an error, Node will crash. And you don't want Node to crash. You know, you have a production server, you don't want that to crash. So you have to handle the error and able to allow it to continue to move forward. Okay. So, and you will find instances where you'll just see a dot then. Don't be that programmer. If you have a dot then, just do a dot catch to go along with it. That way you're sure that you're handling it properly. Now, we can build the same thing again. Let's see. Okay. So we're going to do the same thing, but this time we'll do it as a async function. And just to make it different, I'm going to do /u just so that we have a different endpoint and they both work. Okay. So now, if we want to use an async function, the first thing we have to do, of course, is put async here. And that goes before the callback. And then we need to do a couple of things. Remember what I said about an error. If we catch an error, the database, the node server will continue. If we failed to do that, then we will end up with a problem because it will crash. Or it could crash, not in all instances. Why are we getting this? Expects, what are you talking about? Stupid printers. So here we need to do a try catch. And so just the same where you keep it in your mind and you say, hey, dot then, I have a dot catch. If you decide to do async, you do a try catch. Just put those in your mind. And what in the world does it want?
Async maybe? Misspell.
Oh yeah, there you go. Good catch. Like, wait a minute. Thank you. And so if we do async, try catch. Just call it what it is and do the same thing. Now, in that catch, we want to, right off the bat, let's go ahead and console log our error. And we also will then return a status of 500, same thing that we have above. So we've handled the error because async await is still a promise. It's just, they call it syntactic sugar, but it's still a promise. Okay. And there's actually 3 methods for asynchronous that the first one is callbacks, right? See right here, this is a callback. So something happens, then it calls back another function. Then you have the then catch, the traditional promise, and then you have the async await. You can use which ones you feel comfortable with until you're told you have to use something one way or the other. Okay. Some companies will use one, some will use the other, but get comfortable with them both and find what you like. So in this instance, one of the really great things about async await is unlike here. So when we use this promise, we get the promise back from the database, and that promise is this users right here, not the big one. Don't get them confused. The promise that is returned to us is the users. In async await, we have a really nice thing about it is that we can assign that promise to a variable. And that gives us a lot of opportunities to do things that we may not be able to do with a promise in a .then. And so users, again, keeping the exact same naming. Here, we're going to go ahead and do await, and we're going to have the exact same model connection, right? Users.find. We're going to do the exact same thing. But now what happens is the code works just a little bit different. When we go to /u, and it's going to start right here. It's going to reach out and create this promise, and it will await until it's done, and it will assign that value to users. If this promise right here rejects, it'll send it to this catch. So sometimes that's a little confusing. Here it makes a little more sense. If this one doesn't work, it goes to this one. But here, if this breaks, it kicks it out to this catch. And so sometimes that throws a little bit of confusion in the game. And so with this, users, remember this is the promise, this is this, then we just want to do the same thing that we did above. We just want to go ahead and do a status, this exact same line. We'll go ahead and save that. We're running. Now I'm going to do a /u. Let's try that again. And we should get the exact same thing that we got over here. Both are perfectly acceptable. The advantage of async await, the first one is this ability to define variables. And the second, you'll hear it, if you think back to unit 1, you probably heard the term callback hell. Well, there is a promise hell or a .then hell where you can actually say, when this happens, right? So for instance, when we get our promise back, we want to return that. And then maybe we want to also reach out to the database, find by ID, for instance, and we want to do something else, right? And then we would have this process where you start getting nested .thens inside of nested .thens. And this gets to be a little bit troublesome, where in that exact same situation, we could do something here. We could say, well, we're just going to say user and await that. And if I can ever spell, find by ID. And then we can have this as a separate promise, and it will go through this one, then it'll go through this one. And now we have two variables. So if you find yourself having to do another .then, I would say generally take a look at async await and go ahead and use it there. Questions on this particular example? So I will tell you, I used to be a college professor. I'm very good at calling on people if I hear silence.
I got a question.
There we go.
Does the order matter with the variables on the async await? I feel like in the homework it kind of showed that, but I'm not entirely sure.
Define that question just a little bit more for me.
So like under the try, if you had like the define by ID and then just the regular find, would it matter if one or the other was above or below the other?
Depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So I mean, just by order of operations. Okay. So in this particular instance, maybe we want to find all of the users first, right? And not that this is not a very practical example in that, but let's just say for whatever reason that we had some other bit of information inside of each of our user objects, right? Maybe we have let's say we have a role, and you have, clients and admin, for instance, right? So maybe for whatever reason, you want to find all of the admin, and the way that you've chosen to do that is you find all of your users, and then you come down here and you say, well, maybe I want to do users.map, right? And we want to map user, and with the user, what we want to do, and say maybe there was another table of information that we wanted to be able to pull based on the information here, their role, actually. So we'll change this. We'll say role, because we're imagining that there's a role here as well, right? ID, name, and role. And so maybe you want to then map the role where, let's say role equals admin, and you want to, so now you're going to map that. And then inside of the map here, you want to say where you want to then do another bit of search. So maybe it's posts, right? You want to see which posts that you can find by ID. And you want to base that on a role, for instance. Okay. And then, so in this case, obviously order matters because we have to have this information before we can do this information. If they're completely independent of each other, you can do them in whichever order you want. But so just think about the flow of information that you need. And if you need one to depend on the other, then JavaScript runs top to bottom, right to left, right? So that's about the only rule you have to deal with in that aspect.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions on this? No.
I think this is like sort of related, and maybe I'm just still not getting it. But, and I know someone kind of asked, I think in the thread, but so a lot of the homework, it was a situation where, like with a delete, for example, what was being returned was just like the number of records deleted, something like that. And then we had to also return the deleted record, like in its entirety, like the object. So in that kind of scenario, is that something where you'd have to like return the deleted number of records before you would be able to then return the object, or like kind of how we were trying to pass those tests? I think I was struggling with that and sort of like how the best way to go about that was.
Okay, so let's look at a delete. So delete is going to take a ID, right? And we want to, so let's think it through here. I'm going to go ahead and do async. Maybe I'll spell it right this time. So therefore, if I do async, I just need a try catch. And for now, I'm just going to grab this information. So it's resolved. We don't have any code. And let's look here. So what do we want to happen when we delete something? And then we can experiment a little bit with what's happening with the return. So we want to talk to the model. That's our users. And I think it's remove, but because I don't think I changed it to destroy. No. So remove takes an ID. And then the model here, and again, this is part of what you're going to learn to write next week. There is some options on how you create this. So we want to return the information from users where the ID is equal to the ID, and then we want to perform a delete function. So here, this is the SQLized JavaScript that tells the database what to do. So if we're here and we say remove, and we want to remove, and let's just do this. There's a couple of ways, of course, you can do it, but this is what you'll see generally most often, right? And we want to remove the ID. And because we're using async await, then we need to assign this to a constant. You don't have to always have a variable with an await. That's a lot of stuff to say. But if you're going to do anything with it, you do. Right? If you're going to return it in any capacity, you do. And so I'm going to say delete user is my variable. And then, oops, we're going to go ahead and await that. So our code says we go to / we take the param ID, we assign and destructure that. We then go to the promise generating line, which is where we're talking to the database. Take that ID. We're going to use the remove method inside of the user's model. We're going to wait a response. If it resolves, we'll assign it to this. Otherwise, we'll get an error and we will handle that. Okay. So generally what is the kind of the normal response, of course, is we could say, well, res.status, there's some debate which code you want to use. There's like a 204, but a 204 doesn't return anything. So that's a confusing one. And remember, a status 200 says, we did what you wanted to, what you told us to do, we did. Confirmed is good. So most of the time you'll see a status 200 with delete. So if we go to this and we delete, all right, so we will change this. And by the way, if anyone's interested, this is called Thunder Client. This is an extension. You can just get it in here. And yeah, anyway, if you're interested. So we're going to go ahead and who do we want to get rid of? And we guess we'll get rid of Frodo. All right, so we want to delete user 1. So if we send that, we get 1 back here. Now, what does this 1 stand for? I guess is my question. What does the 1 stand for?
ID.
Go ahead. ID.
ID.
All right.
1 is the ID. Yeah.
All right, so we'll do 2. We still get a 1 back.
Isn't it the row of
I
data?
guess it's the number of the users that we're deleting. Just
Okay.
1.
So let's do, I don't think we have a 225. We don't have an error handler, but now we got a 0. Does that answer the question to you guys? So we did something, we got a 1. We didn't do something, we got a 0. Think binary.
Yes, that tells us that we didn't remove anything because that ID does not exist.
True or false?
You're both correct. Yes. It's telling us in this case, it's telling us that it could not do it. Even though we got a status, it did everything that we said, but the database is returning this 0 in this case because it could not delete that user because there wasn't one. So with SQL, you'll see it 0 and 1. Sometimes you'll actually get a true and a false depending on which database. It's just important to realize that this is telling you a success failure based on the action that is not an error. Okay, there's not an error. It didn't have an error. It just said there's nothing there, so I can't do it. So false. Okay. So, and if we look at our remove, right, this is just a Boolean. It's just a true or false ultimately. Was I able to delete this ID? Yes or no, true or false. So it's important that you catch that because it can easily lead you astray if you're not, if you're not thinking in that thought process. And this is with SQLite. It's not always the same way with the different databases. But in this instance, excuse me, in this instance, we have removed the first two users. Now, that brings us kind of to the question, I think, that we have is how can we provide more information? And give me 1 second. Too much talking, not enough drinking. So here we can do other things, right? We could say, for instance, what if we wanted to do, and this is really an important part of the learning process, is kind of experimenting a bit, if you will. But what if we said this rec.params, we could say const user and await that user, and we want to find by ID. So this ID is the same thing. And then instead of returning necessarily this delete user, which was just a true or false, we could say, well, let's look and see what happens, right? So here we've said we're going to delete this, and then we want to find this. And this, I think, goes back, maybe it was Drew, to order of operations. So what's going to happen here? Are we going to be successful? Is this just a bunch of mumbo jumbo? Is it?
It won't find the user since it's already deleted.
Ah, right. So let's look at this. Let's give it a shot. And of course, we got to go to delete. And what are we at? Number 3. All right. So we just get nothing, right? So now, how can we test this, right? How can we validate if we've screwed up, if the database is wrong, if our backend is wrong, maybe Thunder client is wrong? How can we validate that? Well, one way, of course, that we could validate it is we could do something like this. We could say, well, let's do a const and let's say user and user, and we can then send it and we get undefined. Okay, that makes sense, right? For the reason that you just said. Because what is happening, order of operations, we've deleted that user, and now, or in this case, then we're trying to find it. So what will happen here? So now if we go to 4, come on. So now we got the object back, but we don't necessarily know if we've deleted that user, right? Because, well, wait a minute, this is kind of an odd situation. What can we do? What options do we have? Because we did, in fact, do something with that, but it doesn't tell us anything. This looks like a get by ID. And in reality, delete and get by ID, the only thing typically different is delete, this would be a get by, and here would be, instead of removing it, to be find by ID, right? So you can start to control the world that you have created. And the ways that you can do that is, remember, this is JavaScript, right? So you could do something like, you could say ID. What happens if we do this? We say user ID, and we pass this message, user deleted. All right, so we're running out of users. We'll try 5. So now we have controlled our response a bit more. This is an object. You can do whatever you want with an object. So we've now said, hey, this one is gone. We want to get rid of that. We could also do something to, like, what if we did this? Okay. So we said user deleted, let's say user with ID of is destroyed. Okay. Again, we're manipulating the response. We better hope we learn this quick because we only got a couple more people left. Okay, so now we've modified that to provide us a message. The key thing to remember is that it is just a JSON object. What if we wanted to do something like this? And this kind of ties into, I think, with one of the I'm not sure which one that you guys had to do, but maybe do some modifications. Let's just say delete, and here we'll call this, nope. There we go. And this is an object, right? And I want to get rid of this. And I'm going to put delete user here. And inside of here, I want to do it differently. I want to say, well, I want the ID of, and this is our ID here. Now we have several different parts. This ID is the same thing all the way around, right? This ID is the same as this ID. The ID of the deleted user is the same as this ID. Right? So we could say something to the effect of ID, and then we also want to include message, user destroyed for being something. We'll leave it open-ended, right? And again, if we pass this delete user, it's a JSON object. So there's our new process. So maybe you want to include something from the ID, which is our rec.param ID, right? And then inside of here, we have our message, but maybe we want to include the name as well. So where does the name come from? Well, the name is coming out of this find, right? Because this is just destroying the user. So it's going to be user.name. And we will try 8. So now we've built the object however we want. The important thing to remember is that if you are adding information kind of successively, remember your spread operator. So you may have to add all of user and do something, right? Let's look at that. We got one user left, right? So if we said user, so we're going to spread all of user and we want the ID. Okay, so in this case, this is what we're looking at, right? This is our spread. And this becomes a problem. And one of the things that you got to be really watchful of, because this is already an object, right? That's why we're spreading it. And we've duplicated this field here. This field is this field, but this already has ID in there. And so it will only duplicate. It will not duplicate. It will spread and unique items will get added. So just something to be aware of if you're using something that has these same key value pairs in multiple places. Questions on this?
So when you're looking at the model of delete, what you need to know for what is going to go in your router function is basically line 44. You're going to need ID as an argument, right?
Correct.
And then line 45 is just telling you what that function is doing within the database, right? That's not necessarily going to dictate what your router function is going to look like. Am I correct on that?
It's only going to dictate what comes back to you.
Okay, cool.
And again, if we look at, say, add user, for instance, it takes in a user object, right? And here it's going to take that user and insert the user into the users table. Then it's going to return a secondary return. So you can see real quick how you can start to get nested issues when you're working inside of .then promises. And here we're going to, after this promise resolves, it's going to actually take the ID and call get by ID and return that first item in the array. And again, this is what comes back. The only thing that determines what you send is the user object. And if you're not sure and you haven't got to the point where you're writing your own migrations, you can go to migrations, find the users. And in this case, there's only two things: a user ID, increments, and the names. And the only one that we worry about is the name.
Can you go back real quick to the user router and show the delete function?
Uh-huh.
All right, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, any other questions on that? Let's see how many people we have. 22 people, excluding myself and now Dion. Come on, there's got to be at least another question hiding around in here.
I do have another question. So you're spreading the user operator, I'm sorry, the user object, and does the user object contain an ID already?
Yes,
And then you're adding a.
We can confirm that, right? If we go to our get and we do a get, well, no, we can't. We deleted everybody. But if we go to our seeds, if we look at a seed of what it's supposed to be, we go to user, right? It has this name that's attached to it. But when we were talking about our migration, there we go. It automatically generates an ID. And so the two things held inside of a users table are the increments, which is the primary key, which you'll learn about next week, as well as the username. These are the two bits. And so that's why we don't have this. We don't have anybody left. And I could rebuild it, but I don't want to. Because that'll just confuse you more. We could write a post. Let's see. We got a couple of minutes. I guess we could write a post real quick. Let's write a post.
And quickly, before we move on, when you put ID there with a comma, you didn't put the colon ID because it's just the same p-value pair?
Yes, because that is this. Yeah. But what we'll do is we'll create a new user real fast, and then we'll modify this so that we can see
Sure
how that works. Okay. So we'll do a post. And when we create a new user, right? So we're going to create a user at slash. So we only want to do a couple of things. We want to take our user, and the user is going to come from rec.body. How do we know that? Because that's where it always comes from. And it's kind of trying to, so this is, if you see it put in some gray text, this is part of the GitHub Copilot AI that I was a tester on for a long time. Sometimes it's nice, and sometimes it's a real pain, and it will mess you up faster than you can imagine, because it is a computer trying to figure out how a computer thinks, and you'd think that would be better than it is, but it's not. Okay, so if you see that, that's what's happening. But in this case, we want to create a new user. And so we're going to talk to the user's model, and then we want the method, and we want to pass that user that we destructure that out, and we want to create that new user. And I guess I'll do this as a dot then. We get and let's do the same one then there's the then. So when we add a new user, right? When we create that new user, we're going to get what back? What is our promise? Our promise is a user, a singular user. Right? That is what we have added to the database, and the promise returns that. And so then we're just going to say res.status. We're going to give it a 201 because we created something. The power is mine. And then I just want to return that new user for now. Okay, so let's go here and let's go to our body. And Happy Gilmore. Didn't know that he was the newest one. And so now what happens? Why is this crashing? And I want you to look at this error because this is going to happen a lot. So in this case, we get this error is not defined. And do you see what the issue is? This is one of the important things to pay attention to if you copy and paste.
So in the catch block, the console log has error instead of ERR.
Exactly. So this becomes one of those situations you will do it all the time. And it's just a simple issue. If you read the error message, it's pretty clear, right? But it happens all the time. And now, let's see what we got here. Post, are we on post? Status 500, error deleting message. Okay, this is bizarre.
In your catch block, yeah.
So let's fix that. Okay, error adding user. But we know we're going to have an error anyway. And this tells us what? The query is empty. What do you think? And so, again, these are things that happen from moving fast and not always paying attention or thinking about our code structure. How can we test this? The query is empty. Well, we're not even writing a query string. How can we figure out what's going wrong with our code? Anyone got an idea?
Log user?
Yeah, okay. So let's start with that, right? Let's see what we have. And I will say it an awful lot. Never, ever, ever believe you're right. Always think that you're wrong. Right? And by that process, you'll always validate. But once you validate it, you know that it's fact and you can move on. So when we send that, wait a minute, we get undefined. Why do we get undefined? Well, how can we validate this again? We can think about this. It's like, what's the problem? Well, let's see what we get for rec.body. Okay. And we send it. Well, wait a minute, we get Happy Gilmore. That's exactly what we want. And this becomes the ultimate answer, of course, is that we cannot destructure user out of rec.body because we don't have a rec.body.user. All we have is a rec.body that has a name inside of it. This happens a lot because here, you know, you get into this habit, you're like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to run my destructure, and you shoot through it, and you're like, ah, darn, right? So this is how you backtrack it. You look at it, and you start at the top, and you work your way through. So what we can do one more time, just to make sure, is now we can go ahead and put in our user here, and save it, and let's send it. And now, right, what's this next one? Get by ID is not defined. Where is this get by ID? Right, where is this coming from? Well, that's these gets are calling our model, right? So we come over here and we look at our model and we're like, let's see. We have find, add. right? We changed this. I changed this just to confuse myself and you, right? We want to, what? We want to call this, come on, find. Right now our server's running again. Let's try it again. Now we get Happy Gilmore, error, insert into users, value Happy Gilmore, SQL constraint, unique constraint failed. What does this mean? Because if you have not already seen this, I would be surprised. But if you haven't, you will soon. So what does it mean? What do you think? Tick tock, tick tock. So let's go look at our users, because this is saying, wait a minute, this unique constraint failed. That's telling us that we are. Wow, we have Darth Marcel. That was cool. But I think what he was saying is that by looking at this, right, the insert into users table, the name, Happy Gilmore, and the constraint, this is telling us that it's not unique. We already have a Happy Gilmore is what it's saying. So let's go check, right? Let's run over here and do a get. We do have Happy Gilmore for number 10. So let's go down here. We'll just confirm everything is working. And we'll say Gilmore Girls, because that's the other one, right? And we'll send that. Now we're getting back Happy Gilmore Girls. And we should now have 2 users inside of our database. And so we've gone through quite a few of our troubleshooting steps, and it's really important that you just read them. And if you're not sure, feel free to Google the unique parts. If I were to Google this whole sentence, right, it may not have anything about a SQL constraint dealing with Happy Gilmore, because this is what we've created. But this error will give you something important. So that's what you want to look at. And in this case, SQLite is pretty nice. If you Google this error number 19, code SQLite constraint, it'll tell you exactly what the problem is. One of the nice things with SQLite, one of the very few nice things about SQLite. And so now we can come back up here to our delete, right? And we want to modify this a little bit. Let's say we're going to call this user ID, and we're going to attach the ID. And let's save this because we're building this custom Dell user. And so let's go ahead and go to delete. And I like Happy Gilmore, so the Gilmore Girls have to go. We're going to delete that. So notice this time we are getting the ID back. They match, which we expect that they should. But that's why when we only had ID, it had this ID field already, and it would not give it to us again. But by changing the key value, in this case, the key, to something other than ID, which was already there, it'll give us that back as well. Now, there's one last thing I want to go over, and this is really important. What is the problem with this particular line? User ID 11. What is the issue with that?
Is it that it's a string and not a number?
Yeah, exactly. So JavaScript is kind of smart. It'll do stuff to help us out. And that process, it'll try to figure out, does he mean the 11 string or this or that? But we don't want that indecisiveness, right? We want to control it because we want to be able to potentially use this user ID for something else. And there's a couple of ways we can make that a number. And we'll look at both of them. And so one way we could do that, actually what we'll do is we'll say user num. And we can wrap this with number. And number is a capital. And that says take this string, turn it into a number. Or the other option is user plus which I prefer mostly, I guess, maybe, I don't know, it's not necessarily because I'm lazy, but I just like it better, is you can put a plus sign in front of it. And so if we test that now, and our last user, happy, well, don't you know where your home is? Boom. Right. So now we have numbers there as well. Either of these are perfectly fine. But it's just important to remember that. Final questions.
So I guess I kind of have one as a general question, but I'm not sure how to word it. Like, so can these routers, they can't interact with any of the database without going through the models? Is that a right assumption or?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, conceptually, okay. Yes, you're right. You could do some thing where the endpoint reaches out to another endpoint and that endpoint works on the database, but it's still going to have to go through a model of some kind.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question going back to the like where you were spreading the user and you had the ID underneath it. Is because when we're spreading the user, it already has the ID in there.
Yes.
Is there any reason why we would put ID under there? Because it seems kind of redundant. Okay.
Not a reason. The only reason that you might do it is in a situation like what we had here, where maybe for some odd reason that, let's say that your front end, they're working with it, they've done all kinds of great, just bad to the bone, we're legitimate React devs, but we named everything user ID instead of ID. Right? And they're not going to go back in and change it. You could do something like that. Potentially you might want to add that on there. Typically though, where you would use it, maybe for whatever reason, let's say that you actually are going to create a new user number or user ID that relies on the database primary key of something, but you're going to do some extra manipulation to it, right? So maybe you have something where you're like, well, actually, we would do this, and let's say, 12, okay. And so we're gonna have to go create a user real quick. Okay, now we deleted this Happy Gilmore Girls. So now we no longer have a unique constraint, right? Just so everybody's aware of that. And so now if we go back to our delete and we delete 12, and I put 12 in here. Here's my sign. That didn't do us any good whatsoever. But you could do it where, maybe you're changing that to be something else, and you're using that in a different database. That's about the only reason I could see it. And that's not going to happen very much. And if it does happen, it'll be something very unique. But yeah, the point of ID was just to show duplicate fields will not be displayed. It'll take the last one, and that you can spread something in and manipulate the object that goes out however you want.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
So when you're when you're modifying a user with the put method and it returns an ID, is it acceptable to then, after you have modified the user in the database, to find the user by that ID and return that as the user object that you modified?
Absolutely.
That's how it works. Okay.
And again, it depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish, right? Maybe you don't want that information. Maybe it's a password, right? You're modifying a password. Well, you don't want to send passwords back. But maybe it's a post and you want the front end. So, you've created your own social blogging, app. And when they change that post, you want it to automatically be updating on the React side of it, right? The front end. So you can be the nice guy and send that back to them so that it will trigger the use effect and automatically update. The benefit to this is, one, it saves the front end work. But the other thing is that it saves another call at a separate time. It's still 2 database calls, right? You've made an update and then you've returned that by finding it. So it's not any more efficient. It's just friendlier in the overall scheme of things. And so, yeah, if you want to grab it after you've modified it. So of course, following that kind of logic, these would be reversed, right? This would be your update, and then you'd want to find it by ID. So it would be reversed because of the order of operations. But yeah, absolutely. And sometimes that's a really cool thing to do.
Thank you. Yeah, the only reason I asked is when I was doing the project, I was failing the code gate test because it said I wasn't returning the user's object and I was returning everything. But
yeah, and when you're doing an update, you don't always have to do a find, right? You could take the body that they sent, so we could assume, that this was the updated user, for instance, right? And you could update it and then just return the updated user. And so in that aspect, you would get back what they sent. The only disadvantage to that is you're assuming that everything works, right? So if I take your object, I return it to you and say, yep, there you go, that's what you changed. If you haven't actually contacted the database, you don't know for sure that it's changed. For most purposes inside of Lambda, you can just return what the rec.body is along with it, and it will pass the test. But it's not a good habit to assume that the database is updated. It's much better to confirm that by grabbing the updated information.
thank you.
Any other questions? 5, 4.
Could you talk a little bit about connects? Something that was I just don't really even understand the beginning of it.
Yeah, so connects is just the library that we use to make JavaScript and SQLite easier to talk back and forth. And so connects takes the JavaScript we write and turns it into SQL. It's not a requirement, but it is pretty standard, and it's a whole lot easier than trying to write SQL. And like the 2 most popular are connects and SQLize. And they do the same thing. They allow you to write JavaScript, and then it converts that into SQL for you. And you'll learn that next week. You'll learn how to do it all, the entire process next week. So I'm sure we'll end up spending some time on review next week going over that. But that's what's happening.
Good enough. Thank you.
If we still have time, can you write a quick middleware? Maybe to check the ID or something? Just real quick. And maybe like a logger.
I'm not going to write a logger because loggers are pointless. Use Morgan. You'll learn Morgan next week. Use Morgan. Don't read.
Yeah, I've been using Morgan.
Right. But we could say, we could do something here. We could say, well, let's do const validate ID. And this is going to make a database call, right? Because we have to know if that ID is good. So we're going to make that async, and then we want recresent next. And what we want to know is, so we're going to put this right here, right after our route, and or our URI, the in part. So the first thing we want to know is we want to know for sure, are we getting a rec.params.id? Okay. So, and this will show you a place where it happens a lot. Okay, so we're going to delete. And so we send it. We get back 12, so that means our rec.param is working. Notice it's spooling, right? That's what this is typically called, spooling. It's just going around and around in a circle. And this happens most often because you forgot next. And so you need this next to continue to move forward. And while we're here, I'm going to cancel this. And let's go ahead and remove this real quick. What did we change? And let's see.
I think the method should be delete, right?
Let's see, this one is.
You're posting it.
Oh, yes, very good. Oh, no, we want to create one real quick. And users not defined. User router 61. Okay. What do you got? Another user? Oh, yeah, because we named all of those. Let's just change these back. User, 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 user. Okay. And then with the bang and a triple bang. Okay. So if we look now, we have a few users, 13, 14, and 15. Okay. And now we can go back to our middleware. So this is going to, we want to confirm that the user is there, right? And we can do that by doing exactly what we did right here. Okay, so we can say const user, right? And we want to await that. And what we want to know is user find by ID. And get rid of this, we don't need that. And what happens here? We talked about this earlier. What's going to be the response of this?
An ID.
Okay,
so let's do it. Let's just console log it while we're here.
It's going to be true or false or binary.
Yeah, it's gonna be some form of truthy falsy, right? And so we're gonna validate on delete. So let's say 55. We send 55 and we get undefined. Okay, and let's get rid of these because that's just taking the ID, right? We don't need that. So it's undefined, right? And so that's a truthy falsy situation. And so what we want to do is we want to decide what to do based on that. Now, what did I tell you about async await? If we do async await, we want to make sure that we have what? Try catch. Gracious, I am popular today. It's hard being this popular, I tell you. Okay, so here, I don't want this for now. Okay, so if it errors, we just want it to send an error message, right? So if we send again, we are going to spool because we don't have this in here. Guess we'll write it again. And we're just going to check our user, and we're going to find that here, and then we're going to console log user. Okay, so if we send it, we get undefined. This can't continue because we don't have a next in there, right? So when you get, if you're working with middleware and you see spooling, that's because you're not allowing it to move forward, right? And so we want to do what? We know we want to make a decision based on what happens from that response. So if we say if user what? So if we do have a user, we want to next. Okay. Otherwise, we want to do what? Well, then we want to, we'll just send a JSON message. So we're going to delete 55. We don't have that user, right? Because if the user does not, if the user exists, we go to next. Otherwise, we return the message. And now, so what should happen? We've tested that the user does not exist. Now let's try one that does. I think 14 probably exists. So let's delete 14 and we get this. Now we're back to the problem of this doesn't tell us a whole lot, right? This doesn't make life easier for us. So user deleted. Let's try 15. Okay, 15 was deleted. And so now our middleware is working properly. We are checking to see if that user exists. Now, we do have an issue here, right? We don't want to run this and this because we're duplicating the same amount of effort. So what we can do is we can say if the user exists, so we can now wrap this and we can say, we can create our own rec.user and we can say rec.user. And what that does is that takes this user and puts that on our rec.user. So we no longer need to find that user to get the information, right? We've eliminated that, but we do have this issue of our user. So let's console log that real quick and make sure that we are getting rec.user. And we better check to see if we have anybody left. We got a 13. Okay. Lucky number 13. All right. So if we delete, we get this error message, but we are getting our rec.user, right? And the error deleting our user, if we look at that, that means we have an issue here, right? We have a failure here. And where is that coming from? We no longer have a user here, right? Because now it's a rec.user. All right, let's save that. Oh, we need to go create another Happy Gilmore. 16, oops, and 17, in case we get adventurous. All right, we can look at our delete and we want to delete 16. So now what we're saying is we have our middleware, we're adding our rec.user. What we want to happen is for this return body now to be based on the rec.user. So let's send that. And of course, 16 comes back that we have, there's our user and we deleted. But now this is rec.user because we added that response or that request user in our middleware. And now we can use that anywhere along the line that we want. We no longer have to go find that. Even if we put another one over here and we wrote another middleware for whatever reason, that is console ID, for instance, right? We just want to rec.res next that, and we want to console log our rec.body.id. And then what do we want to do? We want it to go forward, right? We don't want it to get stuck. So we're going to say next, and then we're going to put that in here. And we called this, what do we call this? Console ID. And let's be good citizens and say ID. So now, and we need a comma here. When we, and well, let's clean house just a little bit. We of this too. We don't need that anymore because we know that it works. All right, so now let's get rid of 17. We're going to delete 17. And we send 17 is deleted, right? But notice what we have down here. We got this issue right here, right? So the problem, or what's happening is we're trying to console log this 3 steps along the way. And do you see where the problem lies? Does anyone see it? While everybody's looking, I'm going to create one more Happy Gilmore, and then we're done. And the issue is we don't have a rec.body for user. We have a rec.user, right? That's what we named it up here. And so 18, this keyboard, and we send it. Now we have passed that rec.user on to the next middleware without having to find anything. So that's what makes this process of creating your own request objects and passing those through, because that will be available to any middleware inside of this process. Questions? Man, we wrote some legitimate code here. No other questions? I know there are. Still got 14 of you. Somebody has a question. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Thank you for coming by and hanging out, and for your questions. I will upload the video and drop it in the thread as soon as it's done. No other questions? You're most welcome.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Have a good night. Everyone have a good, strong sprint challenge tomorrow, and I will be around if you need me. Bye-bye.
Thank you.